So, welcome to the next episode of the MoneyWise UK podcast. I'm George, your host, and today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Andrew Spence. He is the CEO and founder of Aspen Advisors. Now, for anyone who has come across Andrew on LinkedIn, you'll know that he's not afraid to challenge accepted thinking within financial services. And I find that really refreshing. And I think over the past year, we've been involved in some fascinating conversations on LinkedIn or outside LinkedIn as well around retirement planning, risk profiling, and also how advisors can better support clients. So today, I say I'm really excited about this. This is great for me. So today we're going to explore Andrew's journey, and I was looking into this. So it's from marine engineering into investment management, and then what led him to build Aspen. Delve into some of the bigger topics facing advisors today, including AI, retirement planning, and risk profiling. So there's quite a lot that we're going to unpack. So first of all, Andrew, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great to be with you, George. Been looking forward to this as well.
That's great. So now, if my research is wrong, I do apologize, but I do believe that you started in marine engineering, or at least that's where your degree was. So rather than I'd just be interested as to how you actually came into the industry, because it doesn't seem like a natural thing to go from marine engineering into investment management. And so kind of what does an engineer see in portfolio construction that others might miss?
So I graduated from Newcastle University in marine engineering in 2006. And one of the things I think engineering disciplines and courses miss is the lack of practical element to the course. It was very much classroom based, and so you don't really get a feel for what it would be like in the field being an engineer. And so that leads to quite a lot of people moving away from the profession and into other fields. And quite a popular destination is finance. There's a lot of engineers that move into finance, and we have several in our team at Aspen. And so 2006, for me, wealth management was still booming at the time. It was before the financial crisis. I was returning back to my home city of Edinburgh, which was obviously, I think, the main sort of centre for asset management outside of London in the UK. I think the fifth biggest asset management centre in Europe. So came back to Edinburgh and a few connections in the space, and then started in the field of wealth management with a company called Gerard in January 2007. And your second question in terms of what does an engineer see in portfolio construction that others might miss. I remember this phrase going around a lot in engineering called first principles. And if you can't solve a problem, then take it back to first principles. And that's really taking it back to a blank canvas and kind of rebuilding it from there. There's also an element of, not suffering noise, fools, nonsense lightly with an engineering background. You try to base everything on a central source of truth. And, with our industry, there's a lot of marketing and noise that goes around products and services in our industry. So I think it's a useful background coming into the field of finance.
Yeah, and it's interesting how rather than going in the traditional route, it's kind of learning a different, I guess, a different skill, isn't it? That brings you into that. I think the other thing, which I think is another thing that I kind of looked at, was I always wondered who came into the financial services industry around about the global financial crisis, and there's this whole generation that has done that, and you sort of said, as you say, you came in, I think it's 2006, so just before it, and so much of your career has kind of been in this world of kind of low inflation, low interest rates, and how has that shaped the way you think about investing today?
It's a really interesting question because it's something that I think, whether it's people that have come in the industry since, say, 2010, or those that just have more of a recency bias to their view on investing. I'm really pleased that I arrived in the industry just before the financial crisis because it allowed me to see what can go wrong, the emotion that people attach to major losses, psychology of investing, what can happen. And also, I remember coming out of the financial crisis, people thought it's not over. We're going into depression here. And so it's very easy to be very negative as well as you come through horrific bear markets. And so it was a tremendous education piece for me very early in my career. And, I think that has really helped me in terms of how I think about navigating investment management, managing clients' emotions, and particularly as we move on to this discussion, the retirement piece and understanding what can go wrong is pretty useful. So I think it was a great time to join the industry. I didn't have a huge amount of skin in the game at that point in time, so it wasn't quite the emotional hit for me that it was for others. But it was a tremendously interesting period of time, 2008, 2009.
Yeah, it's funny because I saw before that, and I guess even seeing today where there's this rush for SpaceX and everything is. I remember in 2000 when everything was, when it had those wonderful IPOs and stuff, and for some people they've never experienced what we're experiencing today, and that makes me nervous. But then I think we're probably in a different world than we were in 2000. Before we go on to, I don't know whether to go on to retirement or into building Aspen, but before we go on to the next side, is there a person or a book or a life experience that has had a significant influence on who you are today?
I wouldn't say there was a specific person or book. I think you tend to learn things from a range of sources, is my view. Some are more impactful than others. So yeah, I wouldn't say there was any one person or book in particular. I think I tend to approach most meetings with the view that you're probably going to learn something of use, and so sometimes that's more impactful and less impactful. But life experiences are definitely the things that you learn kind of most from. So 20 years now in the industry, I've definitely learned more from experiences perhaps than what I've read or the people I've spoken to. And in terms of life events and stuff, everyone goes through life events as they go through life, and they can have quite a material impact in terms of how you view the world and things. Quite often there will be like children or major health events can often give perspective. And for me, don't have children yet, but I had a major health event about 10 years ago which definitely shaped some different thoughts and perspectives on building a business and the views on financial services generally.
Yeah, I don't want to kind of push on that too much, but I guess
That's
that
okay.
does fall into that next question of, I guess, what was the catalyst for starting Aspen? And it seems like your career always starts just before something major happens, doesn't it? So, and obviously, I think was it 2019? So, was there a particular moment when you knew you wanted to build something different?
So I've always had an entrepreneurial spirit. So left I left university in 2006. I remember it was a very warm summer. I was in the garage trying to create. I was struggling to sleep at night, and so I was in the garage trying to engineer a cool mattress because everyone likes getting into their bed, and they're a good temperature, and they've got duvet over them. And then after 5 minutes, you get too hot. And I felt the application could move into hotels, and very energy efficient, and hospitals, and all these sorts of things. So that was first venture. And then when I was down in London, and in finance, I also sort of dabbled in a few apps and stuff. And so I've always had an entrepreneurial spirit to create things. But then I realized in sort of 2018, 2019 that I had good experience in financial services. I had a view and a vision for the direction of travel for the industry, and I was finding that if I was joining small businesses, it was I perhaps didn't have the bandwidth to be able to do the thing that I wanted to do, and so I felt the only way was to just do it yourself and get going. And I think it's a frustration that I've a lot of very talented people that I know in financial services working for perhaps bigger firms, and they're keen to get things done and to evolve and innovate, but quite a lot of departments and committees and red tape kind of stifles that. And so the great thing about starting a business with a blank canvas is that you can build something, coming back to the engineering point, from first principles, from the ground up, to where the market kind of needs and wants, rather than by analogy, kind of what everyone else is doing. So, the catalyst for starting Aspen was kind of those kind of elements. The entrepreneurial itch, the opportunity that I saw, and then the ability to kind of get it done.
And obviously, I mean, you talked about obviously you and one of the podcasts I did a long time ago was about this whole entrepreneurial spirit, and I
Mm.
think certain people have that inbuilt into them, and I guess starting a business is not easy. You've got to find funding, you've got to put it together, and obviously when you launched it, it was kind of just when the world was changing dramatically, or it started
Mm.
to change. What have been the biggest lessons from the journey so far for you?
Yeah, you can read all the books you want on starting a business, but nothing quite gives you the lessons like the lived experience of doing it. And anyone that's listening to this that has started a business will know of the pain that you go through in those early years to get the thing going. A lot of sacrifices are made, very long hours. A lot of that is, there's a selfish element to starting a business as well, because those sacrifices impact people around you and things. But at the end of the day, that's how we as humanity evolve is by starting and building new things. And so in terms of learnings, there's been a lot learned along the way. I'm still learning a lot, especially as the business is growing, about people management and making sure everyone feels fulfilled. You learn from your. I've been in maybe 3 businesses prior to starting Aspen, and I think your biggest learnings are the things that I think you didn't like or that didn't work, and that might be how you were treated. The ability to get things done. These sorts of things are useful experiences before starting a business. That's why I think it's quite difficult to start a business in your 20s in our field, say asset management or financial planning, just because you don't quite have those lived experiences of running a business, of investing, of markets, of financial planning, of dealing with clients, and all these sorts of things that comes with time and tenure. So starting Aspen, I'm immensely proud 6, 7 years on of what we've created, the team that we have. We're still learning, we're still growing, and excited for the future.
And when you look ahead, because I think I look at a firm like yourself, and there are one or two others who I look at who kind of fall into that camp. But where do you want Aspen? Yeah, what do you want Aspen to become, and why?
It's interesting because we had a session on this yesterday with the team in terms of we're now in our world, we're approaching 1 billion of assets, which is kind of like, the door to the next stage of an asset management business typically. And so it's kind of a bit of a time to kind of take stock and you go through the gears of a business. Stage 1 is an idea. Stage 2 is giving it a go. Stage 3 is, okay, we've got a business, it's viable. We've now turning a profit, got a great team. Where do we want to take this? And that's kind of where Aspen is now. And so we've kind of reassessed what is our big, fat, audacious goal that we want to achieve over the next 5 to 7 to 10 years. And in that, we kind of looked at examples of other businesses across industry. And so Sony, for example, I think the founders of Sony many decades ago aimed to shift, I think, the global perception of Japanese manufacturing from cheap knockoffs to be recognized as the standard of sort of premium technological innovation and world-class quality. That was their reason for being, and that's what they were wanting to achieve. It wasn't anything particularly related to a product. It was just to move things forward and to transform the view and position of Japan as a manufacturing center of excellence. And I think they did that very well. And so what we're looking to do, I guess, has moved beyond now what the initial ambitions were from the business in terms of trying to grow an asset management business and do things differently, to now being like, okay, we do have an opportunity here to make a difference and to have an impact. I'm passionate about us being headquartered in Edinburgh and carrying the baton forward for asset management in Edinburgh, which has been a huge part of the city, for a century in terms of the businesses that have been here. So that's a sort of a passion for me personally, but for the business more broadly, is to be a flag bearer for innovation, for progress, and for thinking um, we try to be as unbiased as possible when we look at what we're building. And a lot of businesses and financial services are have a way of conducting things or investment philosophy, and then everything is marketed around that investment approach and investment philosophy. We're trying to always be a source of truth, or look for a source of truth in terms of how we evolve, build, and create things. And so, yeah, our plans are, they're moving beyond what they were 5 years ago, given the kind of journey that we're on. So we're excited about the future, and we try not to measure it in AUM. I know that's what you bill off and things like that, but we're trying to measure it in other things, and that is doing great things for clients and innovating and setting the bar for wealth management.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a different way, isn't it, of thinking about it. Is you can build something and say, "Oh, look at the assets under management," but actually, do you take your clients along that journey? Are you getting them part of your long term ambition? And they're the I don't know. I think in our industry, there's a real danger that you're building something for yourself. You say you're building it for the clients, but actually you're building it for yourself and for yourself to exit and go off and do your next thing.
It's
And
it's
so
it's a really
it's a tricky.
I totally agree with that, George. And we were just talking about this yesterday, because we are genuinely client first. Like, everything that we think about and we do is has the underlying client in our thoughts and in our DNA. But we were chatting about yesterday, so many people, say that. So many people say, it's client first, and then don't live it, or it's actually not true. It's just part of the core values that are listed on a wall somewhere. And so we're thinking about how we, because we know we live it, but it's just how we kind of translate that message so that people genuinely believe it, because it's often something that is said around the industry. And the other thing I would say is, on the first point there, in terms of
Yeah,
bringing people along on the journey, is that we have an EMI option scheme in the business, which I think is a really, really good thing, which means that everyone in the business participates in the growth of the business. And so, I think that's another thing. And then everyone, in the business is bought into the same thing and the same mission and the same goals. So I think that's a useful thing as well.
yeah, and because all I was going to say was, I think, like, I know this is different, but the whole consolidation thing that that the FCA are now picking up on within the advice arena, and I think that is such a big thing, is that effectively you're just selling your clients to someone else to and it's difficult because there's sometimes a good reason why you may do that, but ultimately if you've put on your website the client's the center of everything I do, and then you just go and sell off, can you go, "Oh, it's all right." So, but yeah, maybe that's a whole separate topic on what's right and what's wrong and everything. I'm going to go on to AI and advice because that seems like a really good one. And I think, like, I was experimenting with Claude the other day and building cash flow tools and everything. And I think you started going down that route as well. How do you see AI changing financial planning firms over the next few years?
This is obviously the hot topic at the moment. It's really, the conversation has really advanced in the last 6-9 months. And I think 18 months ago, people are still using Google for search, and now you're largely on one of the AI tools, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT. So I think people are realizing that the fact that that's how we are operating and interacting in other professions. So it's interesting. I went to see the doctor the other day, and if I have a medical thing, I'm on to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, and getting my diagnosis, and then going to the doctor and saying, yeah, it's interesting, I read on Claude that, and they must be getting really sick of that, just as I've started to see on LinkedIn financial planners getting pretty annoyed with clients coming in with their AI'd financial plan and investment recommendations. So it's clearly something we all need to be alive to. In terms of, it's by no means there yet. I mean, I tried to challenge Claude on on an investment recommendation, and it's so easy to manipulate it and say, oh, but what about this? And they're like, that's a great point, let's change it to this. And so it's definitely not there yet to kind of displacing investment management or financial planning. It's definitely there for, usefulness of, I think we're getting there on the writing of suitability reports. I think, the note taking is useful and in some capacity. So there's definitely, some of those more manual tasks are definitely use cases and now being kind of used. And, there's obviously lots of pieces of software coming into the market. In terms of moving to the next stage of a displacement of wealth, of financial planning and investment management, I think that's some years away. I think, this is what I thought about, although this is quite materially different, but my views on robo advice as it's been known from its kind of early days in 2012 or so. Generally, people with the big part of their wealth still want to be able to speak to someone and discuss it, and there's just quite a lot of moving parts, regulation, and things that AI can't deal with. It's all very well asking AI some views and opinions, and that's maybe quite useful for stimulating questions to ask either the investment manager or the financial planner, so you don't come in completely kind of without any kind of views, thoughts, or questions. It's probably quite useful in that respect for an investor or someone getting their, some financial planning, just as a sort of questions to maybe ask or think about. But I think we're still beyond 5 years away from displacement of financial planning and investment management. But it's just so difficult to know what it looks like beyond that, George. Like I just do not know what it looks like beyond 5 years. We're trying to embed AI into our software that we use in a useful sense. Could AI, in 5+ years' time, completely replace the role of investment, management and sensible decision making and things? Quite possibly. We'll see. We'll see where it all goes. I think there's a big unknown.
And it is a fascinating area, isn't it? And I think, there's opportunities, aren't there? And I think, um, I always think, I mean, I'm not quite sure of the figures, but I think at the end of the war, most people, or there were loads of people involved in agriculture and working on farms and things. And then you had all the sort of machinery coming in, and you had, those people went somewhere else, didn't they? And worked somewhere else. And I think it did come across in the last podcast I did that humans are very resilient, aren't they? And we forget that, and we're so fearful of it that, actually we'll just find a different way, won't we? And I think that's where we go. Do you think that, and in a way you've kind of covered some of these anyway, but do you think that it could expose some kind of inconsistencies within the advice processes, investment propositions, and we're going to go on to risk profiling? Do you think that the AI could sort of really sort of push boundaries on things like that?
Yeah, coming back to what you said there in terms of, just on the point of, will humans survive AI? And I'm definitely in your camp. I think the industrial revolution of the late 1900s, the early part of the 20th century, when we saw mass adoption of mechanized machinery on farms. I was looking back at records on our family farm in, say, 1870 or so, and I think there were 70 people employed on the farm, or just doing various different things. And today there's two. And back then people wouldn't have been able to envisage or imagine what their role would be. They would think, well, if we can't, see corn, what on earth are we going to be doing? And so I'm definitely in the camp that we're not going to a world of universal basic income. We all just kind of wander around, nothing to sort of do. I think there will be jobs. There's just jobs that we don't know about yet. In terms of inconsistencies and things in wealth management, yeah, I mean, I think us close to the industry, you and I and people that are in the industry can see inconsistencies and things. I think AI might draw them out more. It might it might take away some of the unnecessary elements of the processes in wealth management. We might come on to the topic of risk profiling and things like that. So yeah, I think it will improve things, but we'll probably have a period of trickiness. And I think particularly around the end customer using AI to give their views and opinions on the financial plan. Do I need a financial planner because I've got all this now anyway? And why am I paying you 1% for this? And yeah, I think that's probably going to be a bit of an annoying kind of conversation that both the financial planner and the investment manager are going to have to kind of justify quite fairly. I mean fairly from our perspective, because the AI is not there. It's not good enough yet for financial planning and investment management. So it's right that that is still a pay for service, but it's going to get a little bit annoying having to push back on that for a while.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the thing with AI, and I've often said this, is like it's almost like, and you sort of said that you've got to push back, you've got to understand what it's saying and what the output is, and then you kind of and it's very easy to go into it and go, oh, I want to go on holiday. Tell me where I'm going to go, and it comes out and says, oh, you need to go off here, and you go, oh, thank you very much, and off you go, and you turn up, and it's like the worst place possible, because you haven't thought about the questions. And I guess that's where you get the most out of it, is thinking about the questions and pushing it to give you kind of, or mold what you're trying to achieve, isn't it?
Yeah.
So naturally, we're going to go on to risk profiling. And I know you've been quite vocal on it. And a few years ago, I was at a round table with the FCA, and we were talking about risk profiling, or it came up risk profiling. And I said to them, do I have to use the tool? And the reason why I didn't want to use the tool was I felt that you put in all this data and it spewed out a number, and no one ever challenged it. They just go, oh, you're a 5. Then off you go. And that's how it was done. And so what we did was we just did questionnaires, and we had this form, or this kind of document that kind of showed what the potential risk journey is. And so I've been quite fascinated by you starting to be quite vocal about it. And maybe I'm wrong in my interpretation of this, but what do you think is fundamentally wrong with the current system?
Or we could rephrase the question: what is fundamentally right about the current system? So yeah, like I've got quite strong views on this, and it comes back to let's pretend we didn't have risk profiles. Would we create them? Risk profiling questionnaires, and we know about those that are in the industry, either wealth planning or yourself, ourselves, that understand the journey and the experience of the objectives of clients and the time horizons that they operate under. The current risk profiling questions, which, and I've been client side where I've had to provide that questionnaire to a client, and it's, you kind of apologize in advance and you kind of go through that process. I think what is my major issue with risk profiling is, at the moment, is not necessarily, there's no real harm in 8 questions to get a feel for someone's tolerance for risk. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's a useful kind of anchor point or starting point for a conversation. I don't think there's a major issue with that. It's when there's 2 elements beyond that. One is this absurdity of there being like 10 providers in the market. They all score in different ways. I could be a 6 with one provider out of 10 and be a 9 with another provider out of 10. And the regulator needs to bring in a standardization of risk, like we do in funds on the SRRI scale, and us to operate under that. And the risk profilers all need to come in line with that, because it's just really annoying, having these different kind of risk categories. So I would say that's one of my bugbears, because we have to pay fortunes to be risk profiled by 7 providers that all score differently, and then I don't think they necessarily allocate the correct risk score to portfolios. I've seen Vanguard Life Strategy, for example. Vanguard's perfectly good, by the way. I think generally, in terms of what they offer, I think the life strategy range is pretty sensible. But Vanguard Life Strategy 20 was risk profiled as low risk because it'd been relatively low risk for a period of time, and then in 2022 it's suddenly not low risk. So it's just it's not great. And then I see on provider fact sheets like 9 badges of risk put on there, of 3 and 7 and 45 out of 70 and stuff like that. And it's just so confusing for the end. I just think the whole thing's pretty stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that, which you kind of covered is, two providers can take the same client and produce different outcomes, can't they? And 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 ultimately, I guess where the FCA are trying to get to is deliver good outcomes, aren't they, for clients? And if you've got this kind of difference, yeah, it does make it messy.
So
Yeah,
So yeah, I think I can see why it was brought in. I can see why it's used because it creates a standardization, depending on obviously a standardization within a firm, because a firm will use a specific risk profiler. They have then that standardization across the client bank. The other area where it falls down massively is those firms that, this is the biggest issue with it, is that someone fills in a questionnaire, comes out a 4, and that 4 out of 7, that is them in a medium risk portfolio. They might be 35 years old and have 30 years accumulating for their pension. So it's clearly not the right portfolio for them to be in. And so, that's not a good client outcome in terms of going by that risk profiling process. So as I said before, I think it's a useful marker. So clearly, if someone's come out as a 4 out of 7 and they're 35 and they need to be more in equities, that's a useful starting point for education. And we need to say, okay, let me talk you through the importance of taking risk and time horizon, and let's look at some charts of some long-term data, and then let's see how we feel about that. Whereas if someone had done a risk profile and they come out of a 9, you kind of don't really need to have so much of that education piece for that person. On the flip side, if someone's in retirement and they come out as a 9 out of 10, we need to have a conversation. Say, look, that's what we've been for the last 30 years because we've been accumulating. Then there's the education piece about bringing them back down the risk category and say, look, we don't need to be taking this kind of level of risk. It's understanding sequencing risk, and then there's other elements to the retirement piece. So it has a 20% usefulness in the kind of framing or understanding of how much a client kind of understands or positions themselves on the risk spectrum. But that's about the extent of it.
yeah. And we're going to come on to retirement planning, but one of the things that I kind of struggled a little bit with is risk profiling it because I kind of feel risk profiling in retirement is different. And there's this kind of shift from accumulation where you're building your assets to decumulation where you're looking more at income sustainability. And I think there's a natural tension in that, because obviously if you're thinking about income, you're thinking about, well, our industry's great on terminology, so you're thinking about sequencing risk, but you're thinking about the ability to cope with a fall in income or potential fall in income. And obviously you've got longevity, you've got inflation. How do you think about risk profiling for retirement? Should it be different, or could you just use what we currently use and just kind of steer people in that direction? Or is it about it gives you a starting point and then you have a conversation?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't have a particularly strong view on this topic. I know some of the providers have produced a risk profiling for decumulation, which I'd like to actually see how they differ. I'm sure they've been, well thought through and stuff. So I think there would be a case for, a different risk profiler in retirement, but I don't think it's necessarily needed. It comes back to kind of my first point on I think it's useful to kind of get someone's sense and feel. But when someone's in retirement, there's such different goals that people have in retirement. Their pension pot might be excess wealth from what they need, so you might as well just carry on accumulating it and leave it for legacy. Or it might be, everything they've got, and we need to be very tight on growing that or accumulating that. They might be in relatively poor health, in which case, it's upfront, care costs or whatever. So it's I think for me in retirement, objectives and goals and time horizons are more important generally than people's attitude towards risk. And that's, we'll come on to probably that's why we're strong proponents of the bucketing approach in retirement to kind of deal with that.
I think that's the thing is I mean, maybe I've got it wrong, but I think ultimately it's about that conversation. And even if you use the tool to get you to a point of a conversation, it's just making sure that you're having that conversation. And ultimately, it's the client understanding, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
the client's got to understand what they're going into. And as an industry, I know that there are some people that aren't that keen on the new financial advice paper that's come out and things like that. But actually, if you look at the direction of travel of where the FCA are going, it's all about your client outcomes, and that's what you've got to think about, isn't it? So we're going to come on to retirement, because retirement is, I don't know why it's, or maybe I'm getting closer to retirement. You've got a little bit further to go, but it is my favourite subject. I think it's really interesting. It's a journey that I've kind of been on over the last 2 or 3 years, trying to understand what the FCA is saying. But there does seem to be a camp, and I think it is shifting, but there do seem to be a number of firms that struggle with building an effective retirement proposition. Why do you think that could possibly be? Why do you think firms struggle with that idea of building a retirement proposition?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm keen to get your view on this as well, George. I know you're very well versed in this field. I think it might be a combination of factors. I think generally, the firms that we speak to are, you know, we quite often consult or give views, but it's interesting to hear other people's perspectives as well. I've done a few polls on LinkedIn to get a sense of where people kind of sit on it, and it tends to, I think, 80 to 85% cluster between the bucketing approach or just holding a balanced portfolio. I think a balanced portfolio is sort of the traditional approach, which I think is a perfectly reasonable approach still. So I guess people don't really see, there isn't strong evidence that actually holding a balanced portfolio is a bad thing. I think it's actually a perfectly reasonable thing, and you draw from that, whether it's natural income or selling down units. And so some people, I guess, have just, maybe done a bit of work on it and realized, we can just, okay, say you've been accumulating your own growth mandate and you go down to a balanced mandate. I don't think that's unreasonable. It's also lack of product innovation, I think. And, that's what we've tried to kind of move forward with the bucketing approach, is be able to provide solutions and products that fit really neatly into those goals and those buckets for that versatility. And obviously, some innovation is regulation led, and the regulators obviously been doing a lot in the last 5 years on the retirement solution, because we have an aging demographic and a lot of wealth is sat in retirement. A lot of our clients have over 50% of their client bank in retirement. So it's a big demographic of an advisor base. So, regulation is also leading this.
Yeah. So it's interesting, because I think, because where I came from was, we were very much that they had an investment profile, whatever that was, adventurous or balance, and they'd get to retirement and they count. And the argument was, well, if you're 60 and you've got another 30 years to go, what's the point of changing the investment strategy? You might as well just keep going. And so I see that a number of IFAs, and the FCA say there needs to be a clear line in the sand. And I think that's the issue, is that maybe that's where IFAs are struggling, is what is that clear line in the sand? Because I think, as you say, you could have someone who's a risk profile of balanced, whatever that means, and they're still balanced when they go into retirement. I think the clear line in the sand is, are you thinking about the income sustainability? And that's the big challenge, I think. And then that goes into the whole argument, doesn't it, of, do you go for a bucketing approach? Do you go for I know, even within bucketing, obviously you can have an income approach, can't you, of natural income, or you can sell down units. But actually, I think it's about understanding what the client is comfortable with, if that makes sense. And maybe that's why firms do struggle with it, is what does it look like? And I wonder whether the industry is doing enough to help advisors. That's the other thing. Is actually, as an industry, are we helping advisors
Yeah.
to get to that point?
Yeah, we've chatted about it, George, and greatly appreciated your views, over the last 12 months on this. I think, again, it comes back to, we were able to build our retirement solution a year or two ago, from the ground up, and with consulting with advisors, speaking with clients, and speaking with people in the industry. And for me, a retirement solution, it needs to be sort of simple for clients to understand and for advisors to be able to explain, versatile to allow for changing circumstances in retirement, reliable to have full confidence in the process, and repeatable across the kind of client base and the business. And so I think those I think for me, that's why the bucketing approach works so well. It kind of
Yeah.
satisfies those four those four kind of objectives.
And I think actually one of the things you said there, which I think is really interesting, is that, like, I remember years ago, yeah, you probably still would have been at school, but yeah, so this is early, maybe going to university, but going early 2000s. I remember we developed this wonderful product, and don't ask me how it worked, and maybe that tells you quite a lot, but it was a unit linked annuity that effectively, it was an annuity that was linked to funds, and so you had the potential for it to go up and also down. But I think one of the biggest problem was it was overly complicated, and actually I think that's the danger, is that the solutions need to be simple, don't they? They need to be, and I think as an industry we need to, because one of the questions I've got here is we've got this big debate, haven't we, as to whether natural income is right or whether selling down units is right. And we do get fixated, don't we, on what is the right solution. But ultimately, it just needs to be really, really simple. I mean, do you have any particular views on that? I know obviously you have quite a lot of views on this, but I remember talking to someone and I was thinking the best way of describing, I speak to people who are very much, you've got to sell down units to provide the income. And I was trying to get my head around it. I was thinking, well, I've got £100,000, the market falls to £50,000, and I was taking 5,000. I can't take 5,000 now as a capital withdrawal. But if I've got natural income, I've still got my units. So as long as the dividend hasn't fallen, then I can still take it. And I was thinking, is it as simple as that? Am I missing something? And I'm not saying one is right and what one is wrong, but I think that's a discussion that people should have, isn't it? Do you agree with
Mm.
that, or do you think that's too simplistic?
Yeah, when I started in the industry in 2006, income generation was very popular. So we'd half client base would be using their income, and half would be accumulating. These days, as we moved into a low income world in the 2010s and early 2020s, natural income was becoming less of a thing, and selling down capital was becoming more common. I probably have a personal preference to selling down capital in terms of you compound the dividends and the income, accumulate those. And the preference really comes in the cleanness of it. The issue with income is it can be lumpy. You might get 6K one month, 2K the next month, and yes, you can keep it on cash and distribute it in a certain way, but yeah, that's one of the things income can vary over time if dividends rise and fall. So again, I come back to the usefulness of the bucketing approach with that, because you can control that issue that you mentioned in terms of the drawdown. Because you have that 1 or 2 years worth in cash, and then you have your next bucket that is relatively stable, and then you have your growth bucket, and so you waterfall those down, and so that deals with the issue of the 50% drawdown, but you can still then have control of the income that comes out of that. So I'm not trying to just convince people to the bucketing approach,
Yeah.
but it is one of the benefits of that. I think if you hold a balanced portfolio, yeah, I think you can take income from it, and I think it needs to be a sensible yielding mandate. Fixed income's yielding okay now, equities are yielding okay, so it can work again. And we do have more people that are using, for example, our income range more now than they did a few years ago, so it's becoming a bit more popular again.
And in terms of your bucketing approach, I mean, I've seen the slide you do, but do you have any tools that help bring that alive other than your kind of slide? Because obviously, from a client perspective, sometimes
Mm,
I remember somebody explaining fixed income to me, and I just looked at
mm,
them and said, "I don't understand it." And the
mm,
fund manager
mm,
started drawing
mm,
pictures, and I understood that.
mm, mm.
So,
Yeah, illustrations are very useful. It's so easy when we get into this industry of forgetting that your audience is as soon you just start to you say one jargon word and you just lose them. And I remember when I started in the industry from engineering, knew nothing. I'd go into fund manager meetings, I'd be like, right, I'm really focused, and then after 3 minutes, they said a couple of words I wasn't aware of, and that was me. I was lost in terms of the flow of the conversation. So illustrations are very useful for this. The bucketing approach can be beautifully illustrated and explained. And I think the final reason I really love the bucketing approach is that it can give people in retirement a lot of confidence that because the news is just awful these days. I mean, not awful news necessarily. It's just the awfulness of, the weight of news is negative, and that can be quite distressing, especially when markets plunge when they're down 1.5% and these sorts of things. Whereas if people know, okay, when these news headlines come, I know I've got my income secured for the next 2 years. I know I've got the next 5 years in something relatively stable. So I just don't need to worry about that. That growth pot that is moving around is long term. So that's the other reason I really love it. And so illustrating that and giving examples and over the last 30, 40, 50 years of market cycles and how that works, I think is very powerful for the end client to get confidence. Because at the end of the day, there's two things that we want to achieve with the retirement piece: is the sustainability of one's income in retirement, so that they can do all the things that they want to do in retirement. And then the other thing is that them not worrying about their pot. And it's all very well educating someone, if you're all in equities in your retirement because the data says that's what you should be doing. But it's so painful. Imagine, sipping your sangria in the Algarve and, your portfolio's fallen by 40%. Yeah, the data might say that that's, the right thing to be doing, but it's bloody painful. And so I just don't think people need to be, they just don't need to be doing that. And so the bucketing approach is beautiful because it gives people that that kind of confidence to just not have to look at their portfolio, just know that they're doing the right thing with their money.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. And one of the questions was, and I think you've covered that so well, is if markets fell by 30%, what would concern you more, the portfolio value or the client's reaction? And I think that's the beauty with whatever solution people choose, and obviously with the bucketing approach, it's actually, that's probably what we need to be thinking about. It's not, at the end of the day, someone comes to a financial advisor because they just want peace of mind, don't they?
Yeah, it's a
They
lot of
just want
work.
to
Yeah.
they just want to say, sort it out. I'm going to go off and drink my wherever it is on some island in the middle of nowhere. Sticking on the retirement thing, I've got one question, and then I'm going to ask you some future questions. Do you think that retirement portfolios should be built around risk scores or around the objectives the clients are trying to achieve? That might be quite a hard question to answer, but
I think it's a very easy question to answer given the last half an hour. I think it's all around objectives. It's objectives and time horizon. I'll give the two extremes. One is I've got ample money and my pension pot is not really needed. Then it's legacy, and that's probably more. That's a longer time horizon and more risk. Whereas if someone has upfront costs, or they want to do some gifting, and then health isn't great, so they need care support, that's a very different set of objectives and goals and investment solution that is needed for that. You still want your money working for you. You still want to hopefully keeping pace with inflation, but you don't want to be swinging around heavily by equity moves. So it's very, in my view, it's very objective and time horizon based, and the risk score is just useful for education on what we then build around that.
yeah. I think that comes into that whole debate about risk profiling, retirement planning, and I think that there is a shift. There has to be a shift between, you're building your assets to when you come to retirement and what happens. Yeah, what happens in retirement, and that kind of falls into some of these future questions that I've got. Is that if you could redesign retirement advice from scratch, and obviously you're not an advisor, so again, it's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily a fair question, but if you could redesign retirement advice from scratch, what would you say that would look like?
Yeah, I'm probably not best placed to answer that question. I've done a lot of work and given a lot of thought from an investment product perspective in terms of giving people the tools to deliver on a good advice proposition. But I'm not at the coalface of speaking to clients. I mean, obviously I canvass opinion from advisors and get their views and feedback, but there would be people out there much better versed to redesign a retirement piece than I am. Apologies, George. I don't have
No,
a very strong answer to
no,
that. Yeah, we've just tried to make sure we innovate on the product side.
and I think that is important. Is that actually you're there for the advisors and canvassing how you're developing your solutions, because ultimately you have to work in partnership, don't you? You and
Yeah.
the advisor has to work in, partnership. So, in terms of retirement planning firms, in the future, so let's say 10 years from now, do you think that there's going to, I mean, I've kind of, again, I go through these journeys of thinking this, and I think like advice firms of the 80s and 90s were come along, sell your product,
Yeah.
and then off you went. And then
Yeah.
certainly the firm I was in, it was about we're investment managers and we're really good at
Yeah.
that, you know. And then
Yeah.
we're now kind of going into this different world, aren't we? So
Yeah.
I mean, from what you can see and the firms that you deal with, you know, what do you think will be a good financial planning firm in the future?
Yeah, you've absolutely nailed the life cycle of financial advice, financial planning over the last three decades. It was product led coming into early 2000s, then it was investment led, and then it was wealth planning led. You know, when I started in the industry in 2006 in a wealth manager, we had one financial planner across 25 relationship managers that were there. That business, that was Gerard, that became Barclays Wealth, that became Williams de Bro, that became Investec Wealth, that is now Rathbones, is now, I think, very much 50-50 planning and investment. So there's definitely been an evolution there. I've seen in my 20 years vast improvement in the quality of financial planning. There was certainly a lot of bad eggs in the financial advice space pre-RDR in 2012, 2013. Fortunately, those lot have largely gone. And now, we've got 100 clients that we work with, and I thoroughly enjoy working them. They're all generally very client focused. And as you say, it's kind of moving into, I don't want to say therapy, but there's a lot to do and consider in the whole financial planning piece, and it's definitely moved on from being a product proposition. There's a lot of regulation to keep on top of. It is quite the profession now, financial planning, and I quite often steer. If people come to me for guidance or advice going into asset management, wealth management, I tend to point them in the direction of wealth planning. I think it's got longevity and then things. So yeah, it's definitely continuing to evolve.
Yeah, I think that goes back to why I think it's such a positive place to think about, and where people. I had a young person said, "Oh, is there much point going into financial services now or into financial planning business?" And I was thinking, I can't think of a better time. Really, it's like the opportunities are there.
Mm.
Last question is, when someone retires, what do you reckon is the single most important thing advisors should help them achieve? Or maybe more than one.
Yeah, I guess you would call it retiring with confidence or financial confidence. And just, people have gone through this journey through life. They've worked hard. They've maybe raised children, and this is their time to, hopefully in the early years of retirement, while still relatively fit and healthy, to enjoy life and to not have to worry too much, hopefully, about finances, and knowing they've got it covered. So I think there's two key elements. One is enabling people to retire confidently and not be stressed about money and these sorts of things. And the other is making sure that the solution is appropriate and suitable for that person's particular retirement journey. And it is a journey, because that will evolve. If someone's 30 years, that's a big journey that they will go on. And that will have varying goals throughout that journey. So there's quite a lot of structuring that's needed for that journey. So I think the confidence factor, the worry-free retirement, which is so liberating if you can do it, and then the engineering of the solution for the journey is the other piece. It's a big job,
Yeah,
big ask.
yeah. And I think, again, I just repeating myself all the way through here. When advisors look at this, it's such a big opportunity, isn't it? It's that whole retirement space, and you do it right. I just think there's legs for a long, long time. So, I know we've covered so much, and I guess there's a lot more we could have covered, but we've gone through AI, we've gone through risk profiling, we've gone through retirement, and for me, it's been fascinating. I hope that people listening to it have found the same as well. And if people would like to know more about Aspen Advisors, I'll put a link on the summary. And obviously, if you've enjoyed it, then please share this with colleagues and help spread the word. But Andrew, I just want to say thank you. I really do massively appreciate your time and just your insight, because yeah, it's been great. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, George. I've really enjoyed it, and I look forward to us, continuing, the conversation in this space, because I, hugely respect the views and things that you have on this, and we enjoyed doing the white paper on it with you as well. So, we will chat again, I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you so much.